Well, first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about my dissertation, which was sponsored by a UK national retail chain that had a very specific question that they were wanting to address, namely, in the light of their already having a restaurant network that combined both locations that you could eat in, as well as locations that were specific to takeaways. They wanted to know whether by introducing Deliveroo into their logistics and their service of takeaways, whether it would actually result in an increase in sales, a decrease in sales, or whether in fact it would ultimately have a problem with the business. So that was the first issue they wanted to address. The second question they needed to address was, given that theirs is a franchise business, and on occasions there were areas of the country where some restaurants had effectively catchment areas that overlapped, to what extent would introducing a third factor in this equation, would that result in a challenge to the non-compete clause that existed between two restaurants? So effectively, those were the business questions. But then there was a final academic question, and that was whether or not the prevailing retail theories would be challenged by the introduction of online sales. So the study really went through a series initially of 10 stages, which is first of all looking at the data sets, trying to work out where there were two data sets. First of all, there was the data set provided by the client, but then there was also the data set of Deliveroo, and they needed to consider where Deliveroo's existing restaurants were located. So that was the first one. So the first stage then, or rather, so that was the first stage. So that was the data. The second stage was looking at maps, creating a series of maps to identify the current and future trading zones. This was the sort of terminology that the client used, but effectively catchment areas, to consider what the size of the trading zones were in terms of the restaurants that were eat-in and the restaurants that were takeaway only, because one had a smaller catchment area than the other. The third stage was really then having looked at these trading zones to consider whether there were what the future would look like when you introduce Deliveroo, because Deliveroo have a trading zone or a catchment area effectively of 2 miles. So in essence, what they purporting to do was to be able to deliver a meal within 2 miles of the actual of the restaurant, because the restaurant was from where they would choose to cook the meal. So then the next stage was, okay, fine. Well, you've got the catchment areas you've got the current catchment areas of the restaurants. You then have the potential future catchment areas by introducing Deliveroo as the Deliveroo agent. But then you have the problem of, okay, but Deliveroo also has delivery services to other restaurants. And it has restaurants that were both in the same culinary sector as this particular client, but also, of course, provides deliveries to other type of cuisine. So immediately you have direct competitors in the same cuisine sector, but then depending on the loyalty of your customer base, you potentially have the competing restaurants of a much wider dining experience. So you need to think about the catchment area of competing restaurants. So then the question was, having done that, you need to think about the buffers for the competing restaurants, because of course each restaurant had a 2-minute delivery zone from Deliveroo. That then introduced the notion of cannibalization, which meant, of course, that the very act of introducing Deliveroo as a logistics provider meant that the national run chain was immediately opening up its client-based cannibalization of sales. In other words, lost sales that they would otherwise not have lost if they hadn't introduced Deliveroo into the network. So then the stage was, okay, now we've got all the various catchment areas, we've got the future, the existing, the future, and the cannibalization. So then we need to think about, okay, well, what is the probability of increased, reduced, or cannibalized sales? And then having done that, you were able to identify the future revenue sharing arrangements. So those were the 10 stages. The other important thing to consider with this study, of course, were what were the assumptions? Well, the principal assumptions were brand loyalty. Based on some research that I did, we were able to confirm that those people who actually purchase food via a delivery app are actually 75% loyal to the brand that they're actually wanting to buy from. So what that means is that if you are actually in the market to purchase delivery foods, the act of going onto the app will mean that in 25% of the cases, you actually you'll change your dining choice. You may change to a competing restaurant, or you may change to a competing cuisine type. The other thing, of course, is smartphones. I mean, this whole study is predicated on smartphone penetration within the UK. And clearly, we're talking about an 18 to 35% age group who have a 94% penetration rate in smartphones. So it's pretty well universal, albeit clearly there's a small potential that isn't there. Interestingly, we also have the question of brand loyalty within users of well, that's the reverse of the top one. Stickability is the issue to do with your tendency to maintain your decision in the first place. These are sort of marketing concepts. Then there was a question of brand loyalty to the restaurant. There's an issue around traffic speeds, and the traffic speeds are important because when somebody places an order with Deliveroo, the location to which Deliveroo sends the order to cook has to be within 10 minutes of the customer's home base. And that can change according to the time of day that the order is placed, which explains why if you have a takeaway location and an eat-in location that are within relative similar distance to each other, it could be that the take-in location for the cooking is not actually the place that the cooking takes place. So hence we need to think about traffic speeds. We also need to think about the numbers of people who have actually downloaded the Deliveroo app, which is actually quite a small percentage of the population. We need to think about the customer for the food ordering. And we then, as I mentioned before, we need to think about the service area of Deliveroo. And we've taken 2 miles because that is the acceptable distance that a bicycle courier would be able to travel without the food getting any colder. So those are the sort of key assumptions. So in essence, what we're kind of saying is, so we did, if you look down to the research question 1, will it result in an increase or decreased sales? What we have here is the map of where you can begin to see the kind of the trading zones of both the various delivery and the dine-in restaurants, or the take-in and the eat-in restaurants. And you can see how the catchment areas begin to change if you start introducing Deliveroo. Then if you move down a bit, you can then see the competing restaurants. So immediately what we've got here in the Bradford area, that although by introducing competing restaurants, effectively the competing restaurants catchment area comprises of virtually pretty well 70% of the entire catchment area of what we were talking about in the first place. So cannibalization risk is potentially quite a big problem. So those two effectively takes us down to steps 5 and 6 that I discussed at the beginning. So then moving down, I calculated the probability of lost sales using the probability theory and using a decision tree to do this. So in essence, I applied the assumptions at the beginning to a 5-question probability diagram. And apologies for it looking undeveloped. And the reason for this was in order to try and maximize the size of the presentation. I needed to begin to play around with the boxes, but I ran out of time to do that. So apologies for this. But in essence, what we're saying here is by answering 5 questions, first of all, what percentage of the exposed to the sales? Has the customer downloaded the app? Will the customer decide to stick to their dining choices? The brand loyalty question, and is the nearest location for Deliveroo to source the order from delivery to dine-in? You can effectively determine statistically whether you will result in a lost client, the sales going through delivery channels, or the sales going through dine-in channels. And you can see there, and I will make this, I will improve this chart properly for the for this version to go online at the end of the seminar, and the probability tree is in the full dissertation if you actually wants to see this. So we can see the various statistics that emanate out of that. So statistically, yes, there will be a loss of sales, but in essence, what we then begin to say is if we look at the if we look on the results across on the right-hand side, actually, this is not one model fitting all. The relationship between cannibalization, increased sales, etc., is actually a function of the spatial relationship between the dining restaurants, the takeaway restaurants, and the location of the competing restaurants. And we can see some examples there. That in the bar chart at the top, you can see. Oh, and I forgot to mention at the beginning that the study was based on a selection of 12 cities, where the sponsoring company had a restaurant, had the restaurants, and also Deliveroo delivered to. So we can clearly see here that the spatial relationship is very significant between, say, Bath, where because there's effectively one restaurant, that by introducing Deliveroo, and the Deliveroo catchment area is bigger than the catchment area of the restaurant, of the sponsoring restaurant, the cannibalization risk is enormous. Whereas, of course, if you then go to somewhere like Nottingham or Bristol, you can see the relationship far more complicated one, because there are many more competing restaurants, and therefore inevitably you're going to the increase, decrease, and cannibalization. Various scenarios change quite significantly, but the average is around 16% increase in sales. So overall, by introducing Deliveroo into its network, this company can reasonably expect to see an overall increase of around 16%. Some areas clearly not. In Canterbury, it looks pretty remote that they will see any increase, but in other areas they will see some substantial increases. So the question then is, okay, now how are we doing for time, by the way?
Perhaps you could aim for another one to 1.5 minutes. We should slowly move over to the next one.
Fine. So the question then is, can you use GIS for revenue allocation? And the answer is yes, of course you can. You can do it by looking at postcodes, which you can turn the postcode polygons into points and then do a nearest neighbor analysis, and you can then clearly see there that the allocation between the allocation to the two restaurants will differ. Whereas if you're doing it in terms of the proportionality of the original size of the trading zones, clearly the allocation changes. So again here, I think the message is that the allocation models are also a function of the spatial relation between the various restaurants. And then finally, from the perspective of the kind of, if you like, the academic question, are changes to retail theories required? And actually the answer is yes. I mean, there are a number of retail theories. They go back quite substantially. And indeed, of course, more recently, one needs to think about behavioral analysis, because the economic theory behavioral analysis, which I've also built into this study. And what we're really saying here, of course, is in the physical world, or in the real world, if you like, it is the customer that moves to the product. So distance, of course, is important, as is time, because, of course, it's the time it takes for the individual to go to the shop to actually purchase the product. And clearly cost is a function of the travel time. Whereas in the online world, the distance, time, cost variables still exist. But actually, what has changed, of course, is the travel time and the algorithms behind delivery, being able to deliver the product to the customer. So the variables are the same, but the customer's travel time ceases to be of any significance at all.
Okay.
And time becomes a waiting time, and a cost, of course, becomes the product cost. So that's a very quick run through, if you like, of the paper that's available on the portal.